December 7, 1941. The smoke still rises over Pearl Harbor when the coded message reaches Tokyo. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carriers have returned safely. 8 American battleships sit broken in Hawaiian waters. The Imperial Japanese Navy has executed what many consider the most devastating surprise attack in naval history. In the war room of the Imperial Navy Ministry, senior officers gather around maps of the Pacific. There is laughter. Not the nervous kind that comes before battle, but the confident laughter of men who believe they have just won a war in a single morning. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki writes in his diary that evening about the pathetic state of American defenses. Another officer jokes that the Americans will sue for peace before summer. They have studied American culture, its love of comfort, its democratic chaos, its divided politics. They believe a nation so soft, so far from warrior tradition, will never endure a long war across 5,000 miles of ocean. They are wrong. Catastrophically, historically, irreversibly wrong. To understand how completely Japan miscalculated, you must first understand what brought them to that moment of false triumph. By 1941, the Japanese Empire had been at war for nearly a decade. It began in Manchuria in 1931, expanded into full invasion of China in 1937, and metastasized into a grand vision called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was the polite name for what was actually happening: Japan seizing territory, resources, and power across Asia. The problem was resources. Japan is a nation of islands with almost no oil, limited steel production, and rubber supplies dependent entirely on imports. Every gallon of fuel for their ships, every ton of steel for their aircraft, every ounce of rubber for their vehicles came from somewhere else. Hen Japan invaded French Indochina in 1940. The United States responded with sanctions, then embargoes. By summer of 1941, America had frozen Japanese assets and cut off oil exports. For Japan's military leadership, this was intolerable. Their war machine would run dry within months. They faced a choice: withdraw from China and submit to American demands, or strike south to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the resources of British Malaya. They chose war. But there was a problem with that plan. The American Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, sat like a loaded gun pointed at any Japanese move south. If Japan tried to take Southeast Asia, the U.S. Navy could cut their supply lines, strangle their convoys, turn their conquest into a siege. The solution, in the minds of Japan's admirals, was simple: destroy the Pacific Fleet before America even entered the war. Hit them so hard, so suddenly, that the United States would be forced to negotiate while Japan consolidated its empire. It was a plan built on a foundation of assumptions. The first assumption was tactical: that aircraft carriers and battleships could be destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The second was cultural: that Americans lacked the stomach for sacrifice and the patience for a long war. The third was industrial: that Japan's edge in naval aviation and combat experience would offset America's larger economy. All three assumptions seemed reasonable in December 1941. The Imperial Japanese Navy was, by any measure, a formidable force. It possessed 10 aircraft carriers, including the powerful Akagi and Kaga. Its pilots were among the most experienced in the world, hardened by years of combat over China. The Zero fighter was faster and more maneuverable than anything America had in the Pacific. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, rigorous training, spiritual discipline, and the offensive spirit called kukogeki. Their torpedoes were better. Their night fighting tactics were superior. Their admirals had studied Jutland, Tsushima, and every major naval battle in history. They believed in the decisive battle, the single engagement that would determine the war's outcome, just as Togo had destroyed the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905. Pearl Harbor was meant to create the conditions for that decisive battle, or better yet, avoid the need for one entirely by breaking American will. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor Plan, was more cautious than his colleagues. He had lived in America, studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial power in ways many Japanese officers did not. He had warned the government that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but he had utterly no confidence in a long war against the United States. His concerns were noted and ignored. The Japanese High Command believed they understood America. They saw a nation still recovering from the Great Depression, a people tired of Europe's wars, a democracy paralyzed by debate. Isolationist sentiment was strong in 1941. The America First Committee had 800,000 members arguing against involvement in foreign conflicts. Congress had only narrowly extended the military draft by a single vote that September. Hollywood made movies about angsters and romance, not war and sacrifice. To Japanese planners, this looked like weakness. They saw labor strikes in American factories, political divisions between Republicans and Democrats, a military that ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than Romania's. What they failed to see was potential. In 1940, while Japan was already fighting in China, the United States passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act. This legislation authorized construction of 200 new warships, including 18 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. It was the largest naval expansion program in American history, a $70 billion commitment in today's money. But in December 1941, most of those ships existed only as blueprints and steel orders. Japanese intelligence knew about the program but dismissed its timeline. Building a battleship took 4 years. An aircraft carrier took 3. By Japanese calculations, even if America started immediately, their new fleet wouldn't arrive until 1944 or 1945. The war would be over by then, or at least decided. What Japanese planners fundamentally misunderstood was the nature of American industrial capacity. They saw the current output and missed the ceiling. The United States in 1941 was not yet a war economy. Its factories made automobiles, refrigerators, radios, consumer goods. Its shipyards built cargo vessels and fishing boats at a leisurely peacetime pace. Its workforce was still partially unemployed, its factories running single shifts, its industrial might constrained by peace and profit margins rather than survival. Japan, by contrast, was already at maximum war production. Every factory was converted, every shift was running, every resource was allocated to the military. They looked at their own output, looked at America's current output, and assumed the gap was manageable. They forgot that America's industrial capacity was barely awake. Admiral Yamamoto understood this. In private conversations, he spoke of America's ability to produce automobiles, steel, and aircraft. He knew that a nation building 5 million cars a year could build 50,000 tanks if motivated. He knew that American shipyards, if pushed, could do things Japanese yards could not imagine. But Yamamoto's voice was one among many, and the others believed in Japanese spirit, Japanese skill, Japanese destiny. There was also racism in the calculation. Japanese military culture in the 1930s and 40s was soaked in propaganda about Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit that made their soldiers and sailors superior to soft Western adversaries. They believed Americans were individualistic, undisciplined, more concerned with comfort than victory. These weren't just propaganda lines for the public. Senior officers genuinely believed them. After Pearl Harbor, those beliefs seemed confirmed. The attack sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, killed 2,400 Americans, and accomplished all its tactical objectives. Japan's losses were minimal: 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia like a tsunami. Wake Island fell, Guam fell, Hong Kong fell. The Philippines fell, with 75,000 American and Filipino troops surrendering at Bataan in the largest capitulation in U.S. military history. Singapore, Britain's fortress of the East, surrendered in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Burma fell, cutting the land route to China. The Dutch East Indies fell, giving Japan the oil it desperately needed. By May 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, encompassing over 400 million people and resource zones beyond their pre-war dreams. In Tokyo, the initial laughter had evolved into serious confidence. Maps in the imperial headquarters showed a vast oceanic perimeter defended by island fortresses and patrolled by carrier groups. The Americans, they believed, would dash themselves against these defenses until public opinion forced a negotiated peace. Japan would keep its empire. Asia would be remade under Japanese leadership. The war was not won, but it was certainly winnable. Then the numbers started coming in from intelligence reports about American shipyards, and the laughter died in their throats. The first angle to understand is cultural and philosophical. Japan and America approached war from fundamentally different worldviews. The Japanese military was steeped in Bushido tradition, the way of the warrior, which emphasized honor, discipline, individual combat skill, and spiritual strength. Pilots trained for years to achieve perfection. Officers studied ancient battles and Zen principles. There was an aesthetic to Japanese warfare, a belief that quality of spirit could overcome material disadvantages. This wasn't entirely wrong. Their early war successes proved that superior training and morale mattered enormously, but it created a blind spot. The Japanese high command believed that American forces lacking this spiritual foundation would crumble under sustained pressure. They looked at American culture, its jazz music and Hollywood films, its emphasis on individual happiness, and saw moral weakness. Americans, by contrast, approached war with industrial pragmatism. If one design worked, build 1,000 of them. If a training program produced competent pilots in 6 months instead of 3 years, accept competent and make up the difference in numbers. American military culture valued adaptability, logistics, and overwhelming force over elegant tactics. There was no shame in winning through sheer material superiority. This philosophical gap meant Japan optimized for excellence while America optimized for scale, and in total war, scale wins. The second angle is industrial strategy. In 1940, even before Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt began transforming America into what he called the arsenal of democracy. The Two-Ocean Navy Act was only part of it. Roosevelt pushed through massive expansions in aircraft production, tank manufacturing, and shipbuilding capacity. He brought in industrialists and gave them unprecedented authority. Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate with no shipbuilding experience, was given contracts to build cargo vessels. His response was to revolutionize the entire process. Traditional shipbuilding was slow, artisanal, each vessel custom-built by skilled workers over many months. Kaiser introduced assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. He used prefabrication, constructing entire hull sections in warehouses and then assembling them at the dock. He used welding instead of riveting, which was faster and required less skill. He standardized everything, creating identical ships from identical plans with interchangeable parts. The result was the Liberty Ship program, which would eventually produce 2,700 cargo vessels, more than all other Allied nations combined. The first Liberty ship took 244 days to build. Within a year, Kaiser's yards were launching them in 40 days. In November 1942, as a publicity demonstration, the SS Robert E. Peary was assembled in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. It was a stunt, but it proved a point. American industry could do things that seemed physically impossible. The third angle is technological and logistical. Japan's naval strategy depended on advanced technology operated by elite personnel. Their Type 93 torpedo, called Long Lance by Americans, was oxygen-fueled and could travel 20 miles at 48 knots, far superior to anything the U.S. had in 1941. Their carriers were well-designed, their aircraft excellent, but they couldn't replace losses quickly. Building a new carrier in Japan took 3 years and required skilled labor that couldn't be easily expanded. Training a replacement pilot to the Japanese Navy's standards took 3 years. Every loss was a permanent loss. America took the opposite approach. The Essex-class aircraft carrier program was designed for rapid construction using modular techniques. While not as individually refined as Japanese carriers, they were good enough and built fast enough that America could replace losses and expand the fleet simultaneously. By 1943, Essex-class carriers were entering service every few months. Similarly, American pilot training was compressed. The Navy created a pipeline that took civilians and produced combat-ready pilots in less than a year. They weren't as skilled as pre-war Japanese pilots, but they flew better aircraft in greater numbers with better support. This was the American innovation. Create systems that turned quantity into quality through support, logistics, and doctrine. The fourth angle is leadership and vision. While Yamamoto understood the danger, most Japanese leadership remained trapped in pre-industrial military thinking. They calculated tonnage and gun size but couldn't grasp exponential production curves. Emperor Hirohito and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo received reports of American production goals and dismissed them as propaganda. When intelligence reported that American shipyards were producing destroyers in less than 6 months, staff officers assumed the reports were exaggerated or that the ships were inferior. There was institutional resistance to believing that America could do what Japan could not. On the American side, leaders like Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, and Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox pushed industrial mobilization with relentless intensity. King was abrasive and difficult, but he understood that winning the Pacific meant building faster than Japan could sink. He coordinated with industrialists, prioritized resources, and accepted designs that were good rather than perfect if they could be delivered fast. Henry Kaiser became a national figure, his shipyards working 24 hours a day with multiple shifts of workers. The government funded expansions of existing yards and construction of entirely new facilities. By 1942, the United States had shipbuilding capacity that exceeded the entire rest of the world combined, and it was still expanding. The fifth angle is the enemy perspective, specifically what Japanese intelligence was reporting and how it was received. By mid-1942, Japanese naval intelligence began filing reports that contradicted the confident assumptions of December. Reconnaissance photographs showed American shipyards expanding at an alarming rate. Radio intercepts suggested new carrier groups forming faster than expected. Captured documents from Midway mentioned production numbers that seemed absurd. A report in August 1942 estimated that the United States would launch over 100 major warships by year's end. Admiral Ugaki, who had laughed after Pearl Harbor, wrote in his diary that these numbers must be errors or propaganda, but the numbers were real. In 1942, American shipyards launched 2 fleet carriers, 9 escort carriers, 8 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 128 destroyers and destroyer escorts. In 1 year, the U.S. launched more tonnage than the entire Japanese Navy had possessed in 1941. Japanese shipyards, meanwhile, completed 1 fleet carrier and 3 light carriers. The math was becoming undeniable. Some Japanese officers began to understand what was happening, but institutional culture made it difficult to speak openly about impending defeat. To admit that American production was overwhelming Japan's capacity felt like defeatism, a failure of spirit. Officers who raised concerns were sometimes sidelined or accused of lacking fighting spirit. The result was that accurate intelligence was filtered through a layer of optimism and denial before reaching decision-makers. The sixth angle is the American home front and the human dimension of industrial mobilization. Pearl Harbor transformed American society overnight. The isolationist debate ended. Men enlisted by the millions. But the more profound transformation happened in factories and shipyards. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in welding, riveting, crane operation, and assembly that had been exclusively male before the war. The cultural icon of Rosie the Riveter emerged from real women like Naomi Parker Fraley, photographed operating a lathe at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California. By 1943, women constituted over a third of the workforce in aircraft plants and shipyards. Entire communities were built around new defense plants. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, employed 90,000 workers at peak, running 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week. Workers lived in hastily constructed housing projects, shopped in tempo. Rarity stores sent their children to emergency schools. It was a massive, chaotic, magnificent mobilization of human energy. There were problems, certainly. Housing shortages, racial tensions, labor disputes. But the overall direction was clear. An entire nation had oriented itself toward production. Factories that had made automobiles now made tanks and aircraft engines. Toy companies made compasses and binoculars. A corset manufacturer made grenade belts. Chrysler built the massive Detroit tank arsenal, which produced 22,000 tanks during the war. Ford's Willow Run plant manufactured B-24 bombers, eventually producing 1 complete aircraft every 63 minutes. The sheer scale of American production was difficult for Japanese planners to accept because they had no cultural reference for it. Japan had mobilized completely, yes, but it was a smaller economy starting from a lower industrial base. Even at maximum effort, Japanese steel production in 1943 was 28 million tons. American production that same year was 80 million tons. Japan produced 28,000 aircraft in 1943. America produced 86,000. These weren't marginal differences, they were different orders of magnitude. Moreover, American production was still accelerating. The factories built in 1942 were reaching full capacity in 1943 and 44. New techniques were being refined, new workers trained, new efficiencies discovered. The learning curve in shipbuilding was especially dramatic. What took 8 months in 1942 took 4 months in 1943 and 3 months in 1944. Japan, meanwhile, was losing skilled workers to combat, losing factories to eventual American bombing, losing raw materials as their shipping lanes were cut by submarines. Their production actually declined from 1943 onward while America's continued to rise. The graph lines crossed in early 1943 and then diverged exponentially. That was when Japanese admirals stopped laughing. The turning point began at Midway but crystallized over the next 18 months as the mathematical reality of American production became undeniable. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was Japan's first major naval defeat. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk in a single day, along with their highly trained air crews. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, the elite of the combined fleet. America lost one carrier, the USS Yorktown, but the exchange ratio was catastrophic for Japan. More importantly, America could replace the Yorktown. Japan could not replace Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, not in time, not with the same quality. Yamamoto knew immediately what this meant. He had gambled on a decisive battle and lost. The war would now become exactly what he had feared, a grinding contest of industrial attrition. By late 1942, American shipyards were operating at a tempo that seemed to defy physics. The Essex-class carrier program launched its first ship, USS Essex, in July 1942, just 9 months after construction began. 9 months. Japanese carriers took 3 years. The Essex wasn't alone. USS Lexington followed in September, Bunker Hill in December. By the end of 1942, 3 Essex-class carriers were in service with 14 more under construction. The Fletcher-class destroyer program was even more dramatic. These were modern, capable warships, not cheap substitutes. They displaced 2,500 tons, carried 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and advanced radar. The first USS Fletcher was commissioned in June 1942. By the end of the year, 12 were in service. By the end of 1943, that number was 71. The United States built 175 Fletcher-class destroyers during the war. Japan built 63 destroyers total. The human cost of realizing this truth fell hardest on Japanese commanders who understood what they were seeing. Submarine warfare reports told the story in brutal detail. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, which meant raw materials weren't reaching home islands, which meant production couldn't increase. Meanwhile, American merchant shipping was expanding so rapidly that submarine losses barely registered. In 1942, German U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied merchant ships, the worst year of the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet Allied shipbuilding exceeded losses by millions of tons. The Liberty ship program alone launched 488 ships that year, over 7 million tons. Japan sank American vessels, yes, but for every ship sunk, 3 new ones entered service. By late 1942, the Imperial Navy staff in Tokyo was receiving intelligence summaries that read like nightmare scenarios. One report estimated that by mid-1943, the United States would have numerical superiority in every category of warship in the Pacific. Another projected that by 1944, the American advantage would be 3-1 in carriers, 4-1 in battleships, and 5-1 in destroyers. These projections were actually conservative. The reality would be worse. The Battle of Guadalcanal, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, demonstrated the new reality in the most visceral way. It was a grinding, brutal campaign of attrition on land, at sea, and in the air. Japan committed enormous resources to dislodging American Marines from the island, pouring in troops, supplies, and warships. In a series of naval battles around the island, both sides lost heavily. The U.S. Navy lost 2 fleet carriers, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, 1 carrier, 4 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. In an earlier era, such losses might have forced American withdrawal. But by the time Guadalcanal ended in February 1943, American replacements were already arriving while Japanese losses were permanent. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers who understood the situation was profound. Admiral Matomu Ugaki, who had joked about American weakness after Pearl Harbor, wrote in March 1943 that the enemy's capacity for replacement exceeds all previous estimates. Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara reported to Tokyo that American task forces were appearing with impossible frequency, suggesting either that intelligence had vastly undercounted American strength or that new ships were arriving faster than believed possible. Both were true. The truth was that America had turned shipbuilding into an industrial process as standardized as making cars. The Kaiser yards in Richmond weren't building ships in the traditional sense. They were assembling them from prefabricated components manufactured in warehouses across California. A Liberty ship consisted of roughly 250 pre-built sections, each constructed to exact specifications, then transported to the shipway and welded into place. Workers specialized in specific tasks, repeating them hundreds of times, becoming incredibly efficient. The yards operated 24 hours a day under floodlights, with shifts changing every 8 hours. Cranes moved constantly. Sparks from welding torches lit the night like fireflies. The noise was deafening, the pace relentless. Richmond alone launched 747 ships during the war. Across the country, similar scenes played out in dozens of yards. By mid-1943, American industry was producing warships at a rate of over 200 per year. Japan's annual production was around 40 ships, and declining. The true climax came not in a single battle but in the cumulative realization throughout 1943 that Japan had lost the war even if the fighting continued. The numbers became impossible to ignore or rationalize. In 1943 alone, the United States launched 9 fleet carriers, 24 escort carriers, 2 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 128 destroyers and destroyer escorts. This was more tonnage in 1 year than Japan had built in the previous decade. The Imperial Navy held a strategy conference in Tokyo in September 1943. Behind closed doors, senior admirals reviewed intelligence on American production capacity. The numbers were presented plainly. America would have over 30 fleet and light carriers operational by mid-1944 versus Japan's 8. America would have 23 modern battleships versus Japan's 9. The destroyer and submarine ratios were even more lopsided. One officer reportedly asked how they were expected to fight such odds. The answer, bluntly stated, was that they weren't expected to win, only to delay and inflict casualties in hopes of a negotiated settlement. But even that strategy was becoming questionable because American casualties were sustainable while Japanese losses were not. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the full scope of the transformation. Japan committed 9 carriers and 450 aircraft in a desperate attempt to stop the American advance. The U.S. Navy met them with 15 carriers and 900 aircraft. The result was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, Japan lost 3 carriers and over 500 aircraft. American losses were 29 aircraft in combat. The battle was so one-sided that it hardly qualified as a fight. It was slaughter. What made it worse for Japan was that those American carriers weren't precious, irreplaceable assets anymore. They were products of an industrial system running at full speed. When USS Princeton was sunk later that year, it was mourned but not strategically significant. 3 more Essex-class carriers entered service within weeks. Japan had no such luxury. Every carrier lost was a wound that couldn't heal. By late 1944, the Imperial Navy had been reduced to using battleships and cruisers as transport vessels because they had so few carriers left. The psychological breaking point for many Japanese officers came with the realization that American production had effectively made traditional naval strategy obsolete. For centuries, naval warfare had been about concentrating force, protecting capital ships, winning decisive battles. Japan's entire naval doctrine was built on these principles. But when your enemy can replace losses faster than you can inflict them, decisiveness becomes impossible. You can win every tactical engagement and still lose the war. American task forces operated with a casualness that would have been unthinkable in earlier wars. If a destroyer was damaged, they sometimes scuttled it rather than spend time on repairs because new ones were arriving constantly. When escort carriers were introduced, they were built in such numbers that they were used for routine transport and anti-submarine patrols, roles that would have gone to fleet carriers in any other navy. The U.S. Navy had achieved something historically unprecedented: naval abundance in wartime. The human stories from this period reveal the grinding psychological weight of fighting an unwinnable war. Japanese destroyer captains reported encountering American convoys escorted by 6 or 8 destroyers, numbers that would have protected an entire invasion fleet earlier in the war. Submarine commanders returned to base describing American task forces with 4 or 5 carriers, only to be told that those were routine patrol groups, not major formations. The scale was incomprehensible to men trained in a navy where every ship was precious and every engagement carefully planned. American sailors, by contrast, often didn't realize how lopsided the balance had become. They knew ships were being built rapidly, but from their perspective, they were still fighting a dangerous enemy in a brutal war. It wasn't until after the war, when captured Japanese records were analyzed, that American historians understood how completely industrial production had determined the outcome. The final months of 1943 and into 1944 saw Japan shift to increasingly desperate tactics. Kamikaze attacks began in October 1944, a strategic admission that conventional naval combat was no longer viable. If you can't build ships or train pilots fast enough to compete, you turn pilots into guided missiles and hope their sacrifice achieves more than their survival would have. It was a horrifying calculus, but it reflected the mathematical reality. Japan could not win through conventional means. By the end of 1944, the production numbers told an irrefutable story. Since Pearl Harbor, the United States had commissioned 13 fleet carriers, 57 escort carriers, 8 battleships, 13 heavy cruisers, 34 light cruisers, and over 300 destroyers. Japan in the same period had commissioned 4 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 43 destroyers. The ratio was roughly 10-to-1 in major combatants. In aircraft, the disparity was even greater. In total war tonnage, including transports and support vessels, the disparity was astronomical. America had built over 55 million tons of shipping during the war. Japan had built 5 million tons and lost most of what it started with. The silence in Tokyo's naval headquarters by early 1945 was not the silence of contemplation, but of defeat. Officers still planned operations, still sent men to fight, but the strategic conversation had shifted from "how do we win" to "how do we end this?" The laughter from December 1941 was a memory that now seemed to come from a different world, a time when the war seemed winnable, when American industrial power was theoretical rather than a crushing, visible reality in every battle space across the Pacific. By 1945, the Pacific War had become a campaign of annihilation driven by industrial supremacy. The numbers at war's end were almost absurd in their disparity. The United States Navy in August 1945 possessed 99 aircraft carriers of all types, 23 battleships, 72 cruisers, and over 800 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Japan had 4 operational carriers, 4 battleships, 15 cruisers, and fewer than 50 destroyers, most damaged or fuel-starved. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the third largest in the world, had been effectively destroyed not primarily through brilliant tactics or superior bravery, but through simple arithmetic. American shipyards had built faster than Japanese sailors could sink. The human cost of this industrial defeat was staggering. The Imperial Navy lost over 300,000 personnel during the war, including highly trained pilots, experienced sailors, and irreplaceable specialists. Entire graduating classes of Naval Academy cadets were wiped out. By 1945, Japan was sending pilots into combat with minimal training, sometimes less than 100 flight hours, because there was no fuel for extended training and no time to develop expertise. These young men flew obsolete aircraft against American pilots in superior planes who had survived long enough to become veterans, supported by radar, advanced tactics, and overwhelming numbers. She was the 13th of her class, part of a program that would eventually produce 24 carriers. Japan managed to complete 1 carrier in 1945 before surrendering. The strategic shift that American production forced on Japan was visible in every operation from 1944 onward. Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was Japan's last major fleet action, a desperate gamble to disrupt American landings in the Philippines. Japan committed virtually every operational warship it still possessed, including the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi. The Americans met them with overwhelming force and destroyed much of what remained of Japan's surface fleet. Musashi was sunk by an estimated 19 torpedo and 17 bomb hits, her destruction enabled by the sheer number of American aircraft that could be brought to bear. The kamikaze campaign that began after Leyte Gulf was the clearest admission of industrial defeat. Japan had effectively run out of conventional options. They couldn't build ships fast enough, couldn't train pilots to competitive standards, couldn't sustain conventional operations against American material superiority. The kamikaze tactic was horrifying, but from a purely strategic perspective, it was an attempt to make mathematics work through sacrifice. If 1 pilot and 1 obsolete aircraft could damage or sink an American carrier, that was a trade ratio Japan could theoretically sustain longer than conventional combat, where trained pilots were being lost without commensurate American casualties. But even this grim calculus failed because American production had created depth. Kamikazes sank or damaged dozens of ships, but the American fleet kept growing. For every escort carrier sunk off Okinawa, 2 more arrived from the United States. The psychological impact of this industrial avalanche on Japanese leadership was profound and is visible in post-war memoirs and interrogations. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, Navy minister in the final cabinet, stated in interrogations that he had realized by mid-1943 that the war was unwinnable due to production disparities but saw no political path to peace. Admiral Toyota Soemu, commander of the combined fleet in 1945, admitted that operations like Tengo, the suicidal sortie of Yamato in April 1945, were launched without expectation of success, purely to demonstrate fighting spirit and justify the Navy's existence. The super battleship Yamato, once the pride of the fleet, was sent on a one-way mission with barely enough fuel to reach Okinawa, no air cover, and orders to beach herself and fight as a stationary battery until destroyed. She was sunk by American carrier aircraft before reaching the island, hit by an estimated 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs. Over 3,000 men died with her in an operation that achieved nothing except demonstrating that even Japan's mightiest ships were helpless against American naval aviation. The post-war analysis by both American and Japanese strategists confirmed what had become obvious by 1944. Industrial capacity had been the decisive factor in the Pacific War. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, concluded that Japan's defeat was primarily due to the overwhelming superiority of American war production. Japanese military records captured after surrender revealed that staff officers had calculated as early as 1943 that achieving a favorable peace required either destroying American industrial capacity through some unforeseen strategic breakthrough or holding long enough that American public opinion turned against the war. Neither occurred. American industrial capacity was untouchable, located across an ocean and continent, and American public opinion after Pearl Harbor remained committed to total victory. The economic statistics from the war are worth examining because they illustrate the sheer impossibility of Japan's position. Total war production for all categories, military and industrial, from 1941 to 1945. The United States produced roughly $300 billion worth of war materials in inflation-adjusted modern terms. Japan produced approximately $40 billion. The American economy was not just larger, it was an order of magnitude more productive. Even more remarkably, the United States managed this production while maintaining civilian living standards far above subsistence and while simultaneously supplying allied nations through Lend-Lease. Japan, by contrast, mobilized totally, reducing civilian consumption to near starvation levels by 1945, and still couldn't approach American output. The legacy of this industrial victory shaped the post-war world in profound ways. The United States emerged from World War II as an uncontest naval superpower, a position it has maintained for 80 years since. The massive wartime shipbuilding industry transitioned into post-war dominance in commercial shipping, defense contracting, and aerospace. Companies like Kaiser Aluminum, Northrop, and Lockheed traced their growth to wartime expansion. The techniques developed for rapid warship construction influenced post-war manufacturing across industries. More broadly, the lesson that industrial capacity could be decisive in modern war influenced American strategic thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The emphasis on maintaining technological and production advantages, on supply chain security, on the ability to mobilize industry in crisis, all stem from the Pacific War experience. The irony that Japanese generals laughed at American weakness in December 1941 was not lost on post-war Japanese leadership. In memoirs and interviews, former officers expressed a mixture of bitterness and grudging respect. Admiral Ugaki, who survived the war, wrote extensively about the miscalculation, noting that Japanese planning had failed to account for the American capacity to treat war as an industrial problem rather than a military one. This was perhaps the core insight. Americans had approached the war not as a contest of warrior spirit or tactical brilliance, but as a production challenge. How many ships do we need? Build them. How fast can we build them? Faster. The answer to every problem was more, and America had the industrial base to make more a reality. The human dimension of the aftermath extended beyond casualties. Japanese naval officers who survived faced the psychological burden of having fought and lost an unwinnable war. Many struggled with the knowledge that their sacrifices and those of the men they commanded had been strategically futile from mid-war onward. The institutional culture that had prevented honest assessment of American capabilities bore some responsibility for prolonging a lost war. On the American side, the veterans who built those ships, who worked 24-hour shifts in the shipyards, who welded and riveted and assembled the industrial miracle, largely returned to civilian life without recognition proportional to their contribution. The shipyard workers weren't in combat, didn't face enemy fire, and thus didn't receive the same acknowledgement as frontline troops. But the war was won as much in Richmond and Oakland and Philadelphia as it was at Midway and Okinawa. The final statistics are worth stating clearly because they represent the answer to the question of how Americans mass-produced battleships like toy models. From December 1941 to August 1945, American shipyards launched 147 aircraft carriers of all types, including 24 fleet carriers. They launched 10 battleships, 48 cruisers, 349 destroyers, 420 escort destroyers, and 203 submarines. In addition, they produced 2,700 Liberty ships, 417 Victory ships, and thousands of landing craft, auxiliaries, and support vessels. Total tonnage exceeded 55 million tons. This was accomplished in less than 4 years, much of it in the first 3 years. Japan in the same period completed 13 carriers, 2 battleships, 9 cruisers, 63 destroyers, and 126 submarines. Total tonnage was under 5 million tons. The ratio was approximately 10-to-1 in combat vessels and even higher when including transports and support ships. These numbers are not propaganda or estimates. They are verified from production records on both sides. They represent the most lopsided industrial victory in modern warfare, a case study in what happens when a fully mobilized industrial economy fights a resource-limited opponent. The aftermath for global naval strategy was equally significant. No navy since has attempted to challenge American naval supremacy directly because the Pacific War demonstrated that doing so requires not just building a fleet but outproducing American shipbuilding capacity, something no nation has been able to do. The lesson Japan learned at such catastrophic cost has been internalized by every subsequent potential adversary. You cannot win a production war against the United States unless you can match or exceed its industrial capacity. And historically, no one has been able to. The laughter in Tokyo in December 1941 thus became one of history's darkest ironies, a moment of hubris that preceded one of history's most complete reversals. The men who laughed lived to see their miscalculation made manifest in fleets of American ships that darkened the Pacific horizon, in production numbers that read like fiction, in a defeat so total that it reshaped the global order. There is a photograph taken in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The deck of USS Missouri is crowded with American officers and sailors. Japanese representatives stand in formal dress, preparing to sign surrender documents. Behind them, visible in the harbor, are dozens of American warships, carriers, and battleships and cruisers, a steel forest of masts and superstructures that stretches to the horizon. It is a visual representation of industrial supremacy, a fleet that 3 years earlier existed only as blueprints in raw steel. The photograph captures the end of a war, but it also captures the answer to a question that Japanese admirals had dismissed in December 1941. What happens when you wake the sleeping giant? The bitter truth is that the Pacific War was decided not primarily by valor or tactics, though both mattered, but by mathematics and industrial capacity. Japan fought bravely, often brilliantly, but bravery cannot overcome a 10-to-1 production disadvantage. The warriors who believed in spiritual superiority learned that spirit cannot weld steel or launch carriers. The planners who dismissed American resolve discovered that democratic societies, when unified by attack, mobilize with terrifying efficiency. The laughter died somewhere between the shipyards of Richmond and the waters off Leyte Gulf, replaced by silence and the numbing realization of defeat. What this moment taught history is that modern warfare is as much about factories as battlefields, about supply chains as strategy, about the ability to replace losses and sustain operations over years rather than months. The romantic notion of decisive battles and warrior spirit, which had dominated military thinking for centuries, collided with industrial reality and lost. Japan's military culture was not inferior. It was obsolete. The age of the samurai had ended, Reppaman-san. Laced by an age where victory went to whoever could produce more, faster, and sustain it longer. This is not a comforting lesson because it reduces war to logistics and mathematics, stripping away the narrative of heroism and honor. But it is an accurate lesson, one proven in the most unambiguous terms across the Pacific from 1942 to 1945. The legacy of this industrial miracle extends beyond the war itself. It established American naval dominance that persists 8 decades later. It demonstrated capabilities that influenced Cold War strategy, deterrence theory, and modern military planning. It showed that a nation with sufficient industrial capacity and political will can achieve what seems impossible in remarkably short time frames. The ships built in those desperate years served not just in World War II, but in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, physical evidence of what American industry accomplished when fully mobilized. And perhaps the deepest irony is this. The admirals who laughed in December 1941 were not fools. They were experienced, intelligent officers making rational calculations based on available information. Their mistake was not stupidity, but a failure of imagination. They could not imagine an industrial system that treated battleships as mass-produced commodities. They could not imagine a nation that would build 10 ships for every one they could sink. They could not imagine losing so completely that the laughter itself would become a historical symbol of hubris. But imagination, in the end, mattered less than reality. And the reality was American shipyards running 24 hours a day, welding sparks lighting the California night, workers in 3 shifts building a fleet that would darken every ocean, while in Tokyo, the laughter faded into silence,